Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for joining us today in this policy dialogue organized by the European Policy Center to discuss the outcomes of the EU-Western Balkans Summit, a summit that took place 2 days ago on December 6th in Tirana. EU leaders indeed call this summit an historic moment precisely because it was held for the first time in the region. And I would say, I think it was widely perceived as a strong signal of the EU's renewed commitment in the region. In the words of EU leaders during the press conference following the summit, there were concrete deliverables that will directly benefit the citizens of the region, such as the energy support package to help the countries in the region address the consequences of the war, a reduction in roaming charges between the EU and the Western Balkan countries, increased integration in the higher education systems of the EU. But beyond these concrete deliverables, the final declaration also contains some language that I personally found interesting, a call to advance the gradual integration of the region already during the enlargement process, and also a call for the acceleration of the accession process in light of this new geopolitical momentum we now face as a result of the war in Ukraine. But concrete progress on actually joining the EU remains indeed the bigger question mark as we reflect on the future of the Western Balkans membership prospects. Is there really a geostrategic enlargement shift and a new momentum, as many now claim? Are things really changing, as Albania's Prime Minister Edi Rama stated during the press conference following the summit? Is there cause for renewed optimism in the region? And how are Western Balkan governments and public opinion looking at this new so-called momentum? Is there also this perception in the region that we are facing a sort of a revitalized enlargement process? 4 outstanding speakers have agreed to discuss this and other issues with us and also help us reflect on the results of the summit, but also on the breakthroughs and accomplishments of 2022, and also looking ahead at perspectives and priorities for 2023. I'm delighted to introduce to you Ondřej Matoušek, Director of the European Policies Coordination Department of the Office of the Government of the Czech Republic, Dragan Tilev, State Counsellor for EU Affairs of North Macedonia, Blerim Vela, Chief of Staff of the President of Kosovo, and Wouter, Zweers, Research Fellow at the Clingendael Institute. Welcome you all and thank you for agreeing to speak at this event. We very much appreciate your participation and input in this important conversation. I will first have a conversation with our panelists and then I will turn to the audience for questions and answers. You can pose your question in writing in the Q&A section of your screen, or really just raise your hand in the lower bottom of your screen, the little icon with a hand, and I will give you the floor directly. I will just ask you to please pose very concrete questions so that I'm able to go through all of them properly. Otherwise, as I said, feel free to raise your hand and take the floor, and I'll give you the floor. I first have a question to all speakers. And that is, how do you assess the outcomes of this summit? And what is in your opinion, what have been, in your opinion, the main takeaways in terms of concrete deliverables, but also the messages and the signals that are being conveyed in the region? How much will these deliverables really help achieve the ultimate goal of membership or even accelerating the process of accession negotiations for the Western Balkans? And can we really speak of a revitalized enlargement process in the Western Balkans? And Ondřej, since I understand you were a participant in this summit, I would first give you the floor to address these questions. So please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the floor. It's an honor to launch our debate like this. Yes, I very much agree with all that you said, Marta, and I do think that this summit in Tirana was a success. You can tell there is a momentum, like you said, just looking at the intensification of contacts that we have been witnessing between the EU and the Western Balkans in the past 6 months, basically, starting already with the sort of an extra meeting of the leaders on the margins of the June European Council, where after which the European Council actually, for the first time, called for an acceleration of the enlargement process. During the Czech presidency, there were many more meetings on different levels, but including on the highest level. The leaders of the Western Balkans met the leaders of the EU also at the Prague summit in the framework of the so-called European political community in October. There was the Berlin process conference or summit at the beginning of November, and now the full-fledged EU-Western Balkans Summit in December. So that is something that is definitely that definitely means something. The fact that the summit was held for the first time in the region was widely appreciated by all the participants in Tirana. It is a big symbolism and a big sort of recommitment of the EU to the region. And as you said, the declaration and the outcomes of the summit include several concrete deliverables in energy, roaming charges, education exchanges, which is something that can be definitely built upon in the future as well.
Thank you very much, Ondřej. Indeed, Wouter, I would call you now on the debate and ask you, do you agree with this assessment? And yeah, speak to us as your perspective as an analyst sitting in more this side of the continent.
Yes, well, thank you very much. To a large extent, I do agree with the assessment of the previous speaker. I think, indeed, for example, it was a good sign that the summit took place within the region itself. It is a symbolic thing. I don't think that we should attach too much value to it. It's not much more than that, than the fact that it's symbolic, but still symbolism matters. So that was a good sign. I don't think that the process is fully revitalized now, even though indeed there were some agreements on some important points and also some practical points for citizens, such as this lowering the roaming charges, etc. But there were some things that struck me and that are also related to the question of whether it's really revitalized. I mean, this call for speeding up the process, I find it a bit strange to have that in a summit declaration where EU leaders and Western Balkans leaders meet. I mean, they call for speeding up the process, but for me the question is really for whom is this call, right? I mean, I think for the Netherlands, it would mean, okay, so the countries in the Western Balkans will need to continue with their reforms and they should speed them up maybe. Whereas maybe in the region itself, it will be explained as so the EU should finally show its true commitment and should increase its support. So I think that call was a bit of a complicated one, and it shows in a way also that those who are in the front, in the driver's seat of the process, they call for speeding up the process. Well, anyway, second, I found it good that the EU asked for this better public communication from the leaders in the Western Balkans to their citizens. That's, I think, a very important point. The EU will really need to hold countries in the region accountable on that point, because if you have these very different narratives from governments in the region, on the one hand towards the EU, on the other hand towards their own citizens, and maybe on the other hand towards other countries in the world and other major powers, then that's becoming a bit problematic. So I think it was very good that was in there, and the same goes for this gradual integration. I mean, we really need to have more context, not only summits like focusing on the process of enlargement as such, right? I think there need to be more sectoral contacts, and the Balkans really need to be engaged on all the challenges that Europe faces at large, right? And make these countries part of the policy cycle on energy issues, on foreign policy, on migration, on whatsoever, all these common challenges that not only the EU is facing, but that Europe at large is facing, right? As much as possible, while even if these countries are now still in the waiting room, as it is called, right? I think that's very important to make sure that they are engaged as much as possible, where possible, because otherwise this waiting room will become a very, well, not so cozy and very long waiting room indeed. So those were, I think, the two positive points.
Thank you very much. I would like to bring Dragan and Blerim now as well, and to have your feedback as well on the summit, and also what's been said. I mean, this call for accelerating the process is a call for whom? I think this is a very good question, and I wonder how in North Macedonia and Kosovo people really read the results of the summit. So maybe Dragan, would you like to comment as well?
Yes, I'm on. Les, thank you. Thank you. I share the optimism of the previous two speakers when talking about the summit as such and the results from the summit. But I used to say I'm too old to be pessimist, so I don't have time to be pessimist. And this optimism, I think, is something that we all need whenever we talk about the enlargement process, considering ups and downs that the enlargement process has faced in the last particularly decade and a half. On the other side, I'm a bit too experienced to be too excited about the outcomes of this summit, because I've been to many of this. I mean, I was following many of these summits, and I've been actually present on the first summit ever organized in the region, and that was in 2020, the EU, at that time, Western Balkans Summit in Zagreb, when we signed actually part of the SAA, first in the region. So there were other summits around in the region, and it's good to have the summit back in Tirana. So that I think that's a good idea. But using the words revitalizing of the process, maybe I can start with saying that the exceptional summit is a serious attempt, and I would use the word attempt to revitalize the enlargement process in the Western Balkans at a crucial time, with the war at the European soil, as Marta, you said at the beginning, with aggression of Russia on the sovereign state of Ukraine, our friend and now a candidate country, and in a very complex geopolitical environment intertwined with many challenges, not to mention Euro-Atlantic geopolitical relations, China trade assertiveness, sort of deglobalization, a lot of sanctions, perma-crisis, I would say. And I think that this is a word that EPC has launched at a certain point in your debates, and I like it very much because, yes, we are in a permanent crisis since a decade and a half ago, and not to mention energy, economic, and unprecedented crisis and everything that comes with that and affects the ordinary citizens. I'm mentioning this so that we understand a bit better the context, the momentum. Yes, we are important. The Western Balkan is important. We live there. For us, this is the most important piece of the earth. But we are not the epicenter of the world. There are many other topics that are also important and needs adequate attention too. And we have to take that fully in consideration. In such circumstances, a lot of energy, resources, goodwill has been invested into the summit from all sides, EU leadership and institution, Czech presidency in particular, Western Balkan countries as well, because we're talking about the partnership. This was a summit between two sides, which shares the same values and which shares, I hope, the same future, as von der Leyen, President of the Commission, said during her SOTO this year and last year. So there was a lot of careful preparation and a lot of good words, I would say. We can mark the summit as success in general. and I think that we can build on that success. But to say that this is a historical summit, I have to say from my previous experience, might be an overstatement, and that's why I'm using the word attempt, because enlargement has been in deep black hole for some time, and it's back since 2018, and going up and down 2019 and 2019 with the blockades, and 20 with the decision to open accession negotiations with Albania and with Macedonia, and finally in 2022 with the first IGC. So it took some time, I think too long time, to bring these countries to the IGC. And I have used the word attempt because the declaration from Tirana has many elements, but not too many novelties, and there is a need for a lot of clarity. Reading carefully these declarations for years now, I can just maybe highlight some positives, which is it is a regular Western Balkan EU-Western Balkan Summit. This is strategic partnership, building up on the strategic partnership. Call for accelerated integration is also very important, something that Marta has mentioned, and I think that others mentioned too. Full alignment with the CFSP, I would put that a bit in more emphasis on that in the center, because this is the building block on which the partnership and trust on both sides is relying. Further regional cooperation, common purchases, energy support, food assistance, AP, green and digital agenda going on, which is good because these projects needs support, and these are big projects that we cannot finance by ourselves. Open door in some of the union programs and agencies. Rome like home, a great achievement, and I do hope that will go on until the final goal in 2024. And EPPO, European Public Prosecutor Cooperation, I think, considering the rate of crime and the corruption in the region, this is an extremely important element, and I would put more emphasis on that, although it is somewhere at the end of the declaration. But there are some dilemmas as well. You have mentioned also the gradual integration, and I would put the gradual integration versus the phasing in, something that is a wording in the new methodology, something that is used as a wording in the negotiation framework, and it slightly diverts from the gradual integration, and I have some elements that I think that there are some elements that needs to be clarified, because we anchored a gradual integration as an approach for the future. Application in practice of the new methodology, some unknowns. We have spent a lot of time debating about the new methodology, but basically speaking, despite the fact that the new methodology was launched in the beginning of 2020, it's still not in force fully, because it will be in force fully once we open the first cluster, us and Albania, and then we'll see exactly how the new methodology fits within the new environment, let's say, or the new invigorated enlargement process. Expectations until the end of the year, I have to say we're keenly waiting for the conclusions of the European Council in December related to the new package of enlargement. There are some also elements that we would like to be more clear in these conclusions, and I do hope that Czech presidency will work on that very carefully, because the wording of these conclusions is important to create a positive atmosphere in the countries and in the region around. And also, I would like to mention that according to the new methodology, there should be IGCs per country, so for all the Western Balkan countries until the end of the year, reflecting on where we are in the process and what is for the next year our agenda. This is a part of the new methodology, and this, if the IGCs are organized and really happen for all the countries in the region per country, then that will be another sign that the enlargement process is really back.
Thank you very much, Dragan. Before I'll give the floor to Blerim, I just have one question related to something that you've just mentioned regarding, you expressed some skepticism on this whole notion of gradual integration phasing in, that I think is what's been sort of conceived in the new methodology that, as you say, hasn't been yet had the opportunity to be tested in practice because we just had the opening of negotiations. But aren't these concrete deliverables already a step towards that that idea of gradual integration, in the sense that, as the leaders mentioned, there's sort of already some benefits that the citizens of the Western Balkans can benefit, and yeah, I just wonder.
Yes, and I understand that the question, but if you open, for example, any of the dictionaries and you try to put together these two words, phasing in, and the meaning of phasing in and gradual integration or gradual, then you can use both words as a synonyms. But in practice, I think the psychological elements is also very important. Phasing in my understanding, is when you have a chance to get into the stages in a partnership process without having some barriers at certain level, gradual integration. What is the fear among some of the experts also debating this here in Skopje, in Macedonia, is that gradual integration does not become limited or fragmented integration. I would like to remind you all that also in the declaration and in the last official documents, any of the last previous official documents of the EU, we are always, and EU is always talking, and we are always talking about full-fledged membership. How to get there is something that we need to clarify. For example, when 2004 or 2007 or even 2013 enlargement has happened, the rules were different and were much more clear. We were talking about transposition of the EU acquis, and that was all. Political and economic criteria were not part of the negotiation process. Now we have the political criteria in fundamentals cluster breaking down to rule of law 23-24. We have the democratic functional institutions, public administration reform, economic criteria. All these elements have been there forever. I mean, whenever we are talking about the enlargement, but have been put in the negotiation framework as part of the negotiations for the first time now. And when I say now, I mean for North Macedonia and for Albania. So we will be testing the new methodology and this new complex strategic approach for the first time. And as I said, 3 years, there are, since the new methodology was launched, and we're still not there, we will have to see and to clarify what exactly in practice the phasing in, or now the new wording, gradual integration means. So we don't want to see gradual integration as a block. We want to see phasing in as an opportunity, as a step forward. Door.
Yeah. Yes, of course. No, I very much understood, and I think I would like to bring others onto this discussion, but maybe we'll delve into that a bit more in detail. But for now, I would like to hear also from Blerim your take on the summit and from the perspective of from your own perspective.
Thank you very much, Marta. In fact, I'm going to reflect based on my attendance of the June 23rd EU-Western Balkans leaders meeting, the EPC meeting in Prague, and also this meeting that happened this week in Tirana. I think the driving factor for EU to sort of re-energize engagement with Western Balkans has been basically February 24th, the start of the unprovoked war by Russia against Ukraine. I think EU member states have recognized that if there is any square inch of a territory of Europe outside of the EU or sort of in association with the EU, and in this case Western Balkans, it will become fertile ground for malign influences by actors such as Russia, but also for rise of authoritarianism, as we have seen in some countries of our region in the past years. We have to note also that the EU-Western Balkans Summit doesn't produce legally binding sort of recommendation. In fact, we have to wait for the December 15th Council meeting. And only there we will see actually what will this re-energized sort of approach by the EU look for the region. And here specifically, I'm talking about whether the EU will manage to forge unity with regards to granting Bosnia the candidate country status. And this is quite important for our region, especially since in June 23rd, following the EU-Western Balkans leaders meeting and then the council meeting, Moldova and Ukraine were granted the candidate country status. So it's only fitting to expect that Bosnia will receive the candidate country status, and then also, our plans, Kosovo government's plans, Kosovo institutions' plans to submit the application for membership. When you look at the Tirana summit, and I must note that the Tirana summit declaration was prepared by EU member states, and the Western Balkan countries were asked only to align. And I think this practice needs to change. If we are treated as partners. We need to provide input on the declaration early on. So most of the Western Balkan countries have aligned, including Kosovo. Kosovo is aligned with 3 reservations, but as far as I know, one country has not fully aligned with the declaration, Tirana declaration. And when you read the Tirana declaration, obviously is what preoccupies mainly EU member states. So first is how to deal with the consequences of the war in Ukraine. Secondly, this idea of re-energizing sort of engagement with countries of Western Balkans is basically laid down in different policy domains. So it's a very good offer, I think, in terms of scope and depth. And then also deal with what some of previous speakers mentioned, the issues of common foreign security policy. But I would like to note, which is not mentioned by previous speakers, the issue of migration again is becoming a topic, quite an important topic for EU member states, and it's also reflected in Tirana declaration, and it refers probably to the Balkan route, specifically some actions taken by Serbia. And unfortunately, some of these actions taken by Serbia with regards to visa policy regime that it has with third countries reflects its corruptive actions against Kosovo, especially in terms of recognition and recognition campaign that they've used. They have silently reintroduced visas towards Burundi and Tunisia, which were highlighted by EU rightfully as problematic for the whole continent. But nevertheless, this needs to be tackled further. I would like to commend the work that the Czech presidency has done. I think they have been a true champion for our region. Their engagement throughout the 6 months has been exceptional, and especially when it comes to Kosovo, with regards to finally having a political decision on visa liberalization, which we hope that this will be done before council meeting on 15th. And this is also sort of the reality that we're facing within the EU, that not all member states probably have the same perception about the risks and opportunities that leaving or integrating Western Balkan countries, 6 Western Balkan countries to the EU pose. And we very much look forward as Kosovo to work with some of the countries that we consider champions for Western Balkans region integration into the EU, because it matters. It matters not just for implementing EU reforms from the technical point of view, but to keep the region stable and peaceful.
Thank you. Thank you, Blerim. And following up on what you've mentioned on the role of presidencies and how important it is, also the role that they play in sort of keeping the momentum going. And I wonder, Ondřej, if you can walk us through a little bit and maybe in more detail, what were the Czech presidency's main goals regarding the enlargement dossier? The Czech presidency has played, as many of our speakers have mentioned, a very important role. And while we're at it, actually, I will bring a question from the audience, from Jacob Wouter, because it's precisely related to this. He asks, what is your assessment of the Czech presidency's efforts to keep the enlargement process going forward? And there's actually also a question, what are the expectations on the forthcoming Swedish presidency and the overall role of the rotating presidencies in this regard? And he asks also what, in your view, have been the main obstacles to overcome among EU member states to move enlargement forward? Because obviously, as also Blerim just mentioned, this is also a very important side of the equation in sometimes accelerating or delaying the process. So Ondřej, back to you.
Thank you for the question, for both of them actually. Well, for the Czech presidency, the Western Balkans has been the priority. That's quite known. The enlargement towards the Western Balkans have always been a priority of the Czech foreign policy as well. And in the presidency, we're focusing on really putting the spotlight or keeping the spotlight on the Western Balkans. Here I would stop a little bit with what we already mentioned about the momentum and the situation, geopolitical situation that we are in, which of course has a very important role to play in everything that we see. The shift that we have witnessed in the whole world basically, but especially in the EU after the 24th of February this year was very radical, and it was possible to react to the new situation in different ways, of course. And in the end, I think that we managed to grasp this. I definitely do not want to say that it is an opportunity. It's a terrible war that is taking place in Europe, but we did manage to grasp this as something that can make us stronger. I think that the EU realized that the geopolitical importance of the enlargement policy itself. This can also be seen in the story of the so-called European political community, which was an idea that was also in this context floated by President Macron first in spring. And at that time, there were many doubts about the project, how this would actually function within the structures that we already have. In the end, the first summit that took place in Prague 2 months ago, from our point of view, was also very much a success. And the fact that in June, everybody was stressing that the European political community is not an alternative for enlargement policy. It's something extra, some new format that should provide new space for the leaders to discuss issues of their shared interests. It was not even necessary to mention that again in October. It was accepted by everyone, even though some people might have doubts about the original motivations, but in the end, I believe that this project actually fits very well in the setup that we have, and it definitely is not an alternative to any of the policies that the EU has been developing so far. So in this context, the Czech presidency strived for achieving some concrete progress, thanks to the basis was already formulated in June in the European Council conclusions. That was quite a successful meeting from this point of view. And not only that it granted the candidate status also to Ukraine and Moldova, but it, as I already said, called for acceleration of the enlargement process, and it approved quite substantial conclusions on the Western Balkans. Following up on that, we managed to finally open the negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania already in July. And it was already mentioned also that we achieved the decision in the Council on the visa liberalization for Kosovo, which definitely was not an easy one, and we also, I mean, you always have to make some compromises to reach an agreement in the EU, but in the end, I think that we have managed a very solid agreement that represents a specific road ahead for Kosovo and its citizens in this area. And I'm only glad that if everything goes as planned, it will be still under the Czech presidency that we will be receiving the application of Kosovo for membership, which would be definitely a very symbolic step in this regard as well. The role of the presidency, of course, is in some areas very important. In some areas, it is going on forward without the presidency even knowing. We are now working very closely with our Swedish colleagues to take the work forward. I think we are very much aligned with as regards our views on how we should continue. It is very positive that we have managed to keep the promise of regularity of EU-Western Balkans summits. So I think it's quite clear that we will be having another one next year. We should be doing it annually. That falls already to the period of the future Spanish presidency. And of course, Spain is geographically different from both the Czech Republic or Sweden. They have many ambitions in the external relations of the EU, also looking in other directions, which is completely fine. But thanks to the decision on the regularity of the summits, I am quite confident that the focus on Western Balkans will be preserved also in the next month and years. So that's very shortly on the main outcomes of the Czech presidency. I didn't mention the one that was already touched upon by previous speakers, which is maybe the most important one, but it's still not done yet, and that's the conclusions of the Council on Enlargement Policy. They should be approved next week, and we are still quite intensively working on the text, and I hope we will have a solid agreement next Tuesday at the General Affairs Council.
Thank you, Ondřej. Dragan, following on this, on Ondřej's comments, I mean, Commission President Ursula von der Leyen stated during the press conference after the summit that this year there was a lot of progress, and she called the start of negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania a new movement and an historic step. And also, obviously, as we've discussed before, a signal that momentum is there. And I wonder if you agree, but also, and you've already touched on that, but what are North Macedonia's most urgent priorities for 2023 in now keeping up with the momentum and making sure that we really accelerate the process and really start, what are the main challenges that are now confronting North Macedonia in this regard?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Marta. Thank you for the questions. I think that we can clearly say that 2022, despite the fact that the year started with a war, yet for us, separating, I mean, the enlargement process in the country from what is happening around us can be considered as a historical achievement. Simply saying that we are waiting for more than 17 years as a candidate country to open accession negotiations to have the first IGC is already an evidence by itself that yes, there is an enormous progress, I would say, a quantum leap into the process. I do hope that we will not stop again as we have been stopped before, and that we will be allowed to go on in a normal pace, in a normal process. Nothing is normal anymore. As I said, there are a lot of things going on in the region and in the global scene in the European Union, and there will be more coming in 2023, 2024, but we'll come back to that, I think, a bit later. So yes, it is a great achievement, and we are very thankful to the Czech presidency. It has happened during the Czech presidency that we opened the first IGC, so it will be marking our history that it has been done during the Czech presidency, as it was. I was around for, I'm around for quite a long time, and I've been present in 2004 when we applied for membership in Ireland. So Ireland is always in our memories. Then UK, unfortunately, they're not members anymore. During the presidency, we got the candidate status. And during the Croatian presidency in 2020, the decision to open accession negotiation was taken. And now, during the Czech presidency, we have opened the IGC. So it was a hectic period, I have to say. July, on 17th of July, we have signed the bilateral protocol with Bulgaria, which was a precondition for conclusions on 18th of July for the acceptance of the negotiation framework, which the next day, 19th of July, so that's why I'm saying 3 very hectic days, we had to go through the first IGC, but political IGC was open. So we still have some political hurdles to go over, like to ensure the 2/3 majority into the parliament in order to have the changes in the constitution, and to round up the first IGC, getting into, I do hope, getting into a normal procedure, a normal pace further on. Good news is also during this year that right after the IGC was open, we have proceeded, I would say, some would say started, I am saying proceeded with the screening process, which is extremely important. I mean, that's a technical wording, some would say a technical process, but it's not. It's very, very political process, and it has to be taken very seriously on that level, political level, so that we go not only through the explanatory screening, but even more bilateral screening now, according to the new methodology, within new 6 clusters, 3 areas I've mentioned already: functioning democratic institutions, public administration, economic criteria, and 33 chapters. Rule of law are combined in combining chapters 23 and 24. And during the explanatory screening, which is still going on, we have made an inventory of over 4,000 legal acts that we need to transpose into our national legislation, out of which about 55% have been already transposed. So we were not just waiting since 2001 when we signed the SAA until today. So we were working, and we have achieved the compliance and, I would say, transposition of the EU acquis in 45 or 55% of the cases. But still, we need to transpose a lot of EU acquis into our national system in the coming days. What is very important also, and what I would consider as achievement, IGC screening process has revamped the excitement among the administration. We have at the moment more than 800 people which are involved. At the end of the bilateral screening next year, there will be more than 1,500 people will be fully involved into the process. And that is a new, let's say, infusion in a bloodstream of the enlargement process, and will, I'm sure, accelerate the reforms process, the deep and key reform processes in the country. So the administration is back. And this is important because you need a critical mass of people in the administration in order to make the process successful, as well as support, a huge support we'll get more from the NGOs, from the civil society. We need also, and we are taking on board the business community, because at the end of the day, I'm used to say that we are not going to negotiate with Brussels because we have to adopt the acquis. but we are going to negotiate with our business community in order when that will happen. So business community is extremely important. And of course, we are trying to bring in the academic community because we are a small country. So every single person that knows something or is an expert or profile expert, has a profile expert into certain area should be bring in. This is something that we are working on, and this is an excellent platform. We have targeted 2030 as let's say our internal national deadline to be fully in line with the EU acquis, and we do hope that we will open the first cluster until the end of next year, the fundamentals, and then onward until 2030 that we will transpose and be fully in line, all the acquis, and we will be fully in line with the acquis, ready to become the full-fledged member. That doesn't mean that we are pressing or searching for the European Union to come up with their time frame, although that will be very, very helpful. But we have our target, and we are going to focus on that. What are the 5 most important priorities for us for the coming period? First is to ensure of course, the change of the constitution, so the 2/3 majority in order to go on and to round up, as I said before, the first IGC. Second is to maintain the macroeconomic stability in times of financial and economic crisis, including and ensure supply of energy and food. Third is to get into deep reforms and to show results, particularly into anti-corruption and fights against organized crime. And these days, this is the hot topic around because of some moves from the United States of America, but also from the European Union. So we are going to focus on that, not only in the legislative or institutional terms, but in a form of results, concrete results. The fourth is to close the electoral reforms to prepare for elections, our elections in 2024, because we have the parliamentary and presidential elections in 2024. So we have to be ready for that. And fifth, to prepare roadmaps for rule of law and for public administration reform, because these 2 roadmaps are the opening benchmarks for the fundamentals cluster. And I said, we do hope that we will open the fundamentals cluster until next year, 2023, during the Swedish and during the Spanish presidency, because Spain is actually following the Swedish presidency the second half of the next year.
Thank you very much, Dragan, and indeed a huge, very complex to-do list ahead. Dragan mentioned this is very much a technical process as much as a political process. And Blerim, turning to you, President Osmani confirmed during the summit that Kosovo will submit the application for EU membership by the end of the year. Why now? Do you think there will be the necessary support that Kosovo needs? Thank you.
Thank you. So it has been over 19 years since the Thessaloniki summit declared the EU membership perspective for the Western Balkans, including Kosovo. And Kosovo's EU integration efforts, in fact, date back since that summit. And the subsequent inclusion of Kosovo's assessments on the progress towards EU membership, it was reflected on an annual basis in the progress in country reports as a possible candidate country. Therefore, it is only natural for Kosovo to submit its application for EU membership now. Kosovo, as a country, in fact, embodies EU values enshrined in Article 2 of the Treaty of the EU. So we have seen, especially in the last year and a half, tremendous progress in terms of democracy, rule of law, respect for human rights, and we have one of the most advanced legal and constitutional frameworks for the protection of minorities. The Republic of Kosovo and also the European Union signed the SAA in October 2015, and ever since, Kosovo has been embarked in implementing serious EU reforms. The trend in the last year and a half has been exceptional in terms of implementation of these reforms, especially since the elections of February 2021, when new institutions were created, which clearly have prioritized the reforms on the rule of law sector that correspond with EU's fundamentals first approach. There's another, of course, important, very important factor, that is the popular support for EU accession, which is constantly high among Kosovo citizens. However, without a doubt, during 2022, another defining factor is Russia's unprovoked and illegal war against Ukraine, where Kosovo has fully aligned with EU sanctions and measures. Our northern neighbor, you can see especially a declining trend in this regard, from something like 95% alignment with EU's common foreign security policy. They have dropped to 46% in the last year. Moreover, the war in Ukraine and the subsequent granting of the candidate country status to Ukraine and Moldova, and coupled hopefully with serious political discussion and decision on granting Bosnia Herzegovina the candidate country status, inevitably brings to the agenda the issue of Kosovo's accession in the EU as the only Western Balkan countries without candidate country status. So this is basically, in a nutshell, the reasoning in Pristina why we have decided to apply. I think we are late in terms of application, but nevertheless, this is the proper momentum, and there is ongoing consultation with member states, including those that have not recognized Kosovo, on how to proceed with our application. And we have been also closely in touch with the Czech presidency in this regards.
Okay, thank you, Blerim. Thank you very much. I would like also to invite our audience to pose your questions, either, as I said, in the Q&A box in the, of your screen, or just by raising the hand, and I'll give you the floor. But before I open for questions, I would like to also switch gears a little bit in this discussion, and also speak, because we're speaking a lot about concerns and to-do lists for the applicant countries. But what about the member states' stance on enlargement and positioning on these issues? And Wouter, can you please elaborate a little bit on the Dutch stance on enlargement, and also this big debate that is looming in the background, but that I feel like no one is really discussing in the context of this summit, which is the big debate regarding the EU's absorption capacity, but also the need to undertake institutional reform before opening the door to new members, as this is something that has been recurrently mentioned by EU leaders as well when discussions on enlargement and the membership prospects come about. So this is very much a debate that is gaining ground, and we see no clarification regarding this discussion, no internal clarification among EU member states. So what's the Dutch stance on this debate?
Well, thank you very much for that question, or those questions. I mean, the Netherlands has, and I think in the past 20 years, we can't really say that it has been on the forefront when it comes to EU enlargement, right? It hasn't been one of these countries that always structurally argues in favor of further EU enlargement, and in fact, the country is known as a rather skeptical country. I think on the political level, the skepticism is still there to a certain extent. On the policy-making level, the Netherlands, in my view, has become a somewhat more constructive player in the past years. You know, the Netherlands has this famous, or maybe infamous motto by now, strict and fair, or strict and fair and engaged, as I think now the formal one is. And it used to be just very strict, especially, and not always necessarily fair or engaged. Well, it is changing a little bit. I see that, for example, in our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, there's really some policy intensification going on. So there's more people working on the region. They are well informed. I don't feel they are very biased. They look at the process from a merit-based point of view. So I think there things are improving, and also on the political level we see some improvements. I mean, our Prime Minister Rutte did visit Tirana and Skopje 2 years ago, and of course this week for the summit. But so it shows that now there's well, I think 2 years ago is a bit long by now, so there should be a new visit probably soon. But we also saw the op-ed between Rutte and Edi Rama written together in Politico earlier this year on the European political community. Now, you know, in this Dutch political landscape still, these concerns about requirements remain, right? And we see that today because just before this event, I was on our national radio to comment on the fact that today in the Dutch Parliament there will be a resolution submitted. I'm not sure whether it will be adopted, but it will at least be submitted, that proposes to freeze negotiations with Serbia, and that there should be a new methodology that makes it easier to halt negotiations when reforms do not take place or when things are actually deteriorating, also especially on the foreign affairs field. Now, I commented in this radio show that, well, I think these possibilities are already there, right? There is the reversibility in the revised accession methodology, and we can actually freeze negotiations or reverse the process or pause it or call it as you want. But at least this shows this sort of resolution, which basically comes from a coalition party, the party of Prime Minister Rutte, as well as an opposition party, the Social Democrats, who are normally quite in favor of EU enlargement. It shows that without these real reforms in the region, and those should of course be adequately supported by the EU, Netherlands and Dutch politicians will not so easily be convinced of why it would be beneficial for the European Union, right, if the countries in the Western Balkans join. So I think still for the Netherlands, it's not structurally in favor of further enlargement. Really, the proof will be will need to be in the pudding for Dutch politicians, and that's really because indeed in the background there are these concerns about the functioning of the European Union, about the deterioration of the rule of law situation in certain member states, and so this plays, I think, an immense role in the background. If all would go well within the EU, then I think it would also be easier to convince politicians to have new member states join. But when it comes to the institutional reform, and we've seen some proposals by German Bundeskanzler Scholz, for example, and maybe if there are more members, we need 2 commissioners for 1 director general. These kind of things, this whole discussion, I don't feel that it has yet fully started in the Netherlands, is my impression. So maybe there is a recognition that things are not working very well, and that decision-making capacity of the EU is under pressure. But I don't feel that the full discussion on institutional reform has really taken off yet in the Netherlands, at least, and also not between the member states. And that's, I think, a very important point. We need more discussion between the member states on EU enlargement, but also on the EU at large, I think.
Thank you. I wonder then if there isn't a gap between this renewed enthusiastic rhetoric and then all the lack of clarification that there is on these debates within the EU, and also how do you strike the balance between this need of a merit-based approach that's very much the stance of the Dutch, but also now that enlargement is increasingly being seen under geopolitical and geostrategic lenses, and to what extent are these considerations being discussed at the EU Council level and among member states?
Well, I think the geopolitical arguments, of course, this year have had a major impact. And for example, when it comes to the European Commission proposal to grant Bosnia and Herzegovina candidate status, and maybe also on some other issues, the geopolitics also in the Netherlands play a larger role than before. But so far in the Netherlands, at least, they do not take. Geopolitics is not considered more important than I think the merit-based approach. I mean, in a way, there's a certain, and for me, it's a bit of the eternal dilemma in EU enlargement. Actually, okay, should we move on to make sure that we can integrate the countries of the region sooner and make sure that geopolitical influence from other players is diverted, or should we first really focus on the reforms, and only if all the reforms are fulfilled then the countries can join? I think this is the dilemma that we've seen over the past years. And for the Dutch position is very, I think, clear in that the reforms are, and we've seen that by this resolution in the Dutch Parliament today. But on the EU level, it's a constant discussion, and I think, that's also why at the beginning of this event, I said at this conversation, I said, well, maybe this gradual integration is idea. It's not that bad after all, because you sort of you make sure that you already engage the countries in the process without where possible, in policy making processes on what field there is. So you already engage them, and then it becomes the dilemma becomes somewhat more less important in a way.
Thank you. I know, Ondřej, you have to leave. You have to leave us now. So please feel free to disconnect. And thank you so much for participating and for agreeing to discuss these issues with us. It was indeed very useful. I know that we have a question, so I will immediately give the floor to Marta. So that she can raise her question to the speakers. Please go ahead, Marta.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So yeah, I'm Berta. I'm from the European Policy Center as well. I actually had one question for Ondřej, but I have also another one for Dragan, so I'm gonna go ahead with the second one. In the past years, the several, like North Macedonia, has had to accept many deals in order to move on with the its path to the EU. I wonder whether that has raised Euroscepticism among North Macedonian citizens, and how do you think the EU or North Macedonia can bring these citizens back on board, so to make them become pro-EU again? Thank you.
Should I take on this?
Yes, please.
Right away.
Yes.
Yes, this is a very good and very legitimate question. I'm in this process for very, very long, and I'm repeating that all the time because I've seen a lot and many things, many positives and many negatives. But I have to say that since the very beginning, which is somewhere in the previous century, there was a very, very strong pro-European or pro-Euro-Atlantic orientation of the country and public support, a very, very wide public support, which went at a certain point of time over 90%. And it has been kept at that level until the troubles began. I have to say that that was that high level of let's say, not only positive public perception about the EU enlargement and about the benefits and about what is to be expected when we become members of the European Union or during the enlargement process or negotiation process was very high until the blockades started. Public support is still quite high, I would say above 60%, which is a fairly high number of public support, but the perception is rapidly changing to not to a better, I'm afraid to say. The last couple of years, because we have been exposed to some very heavy concessions we had to accept, or we have accepted. Even the change of the name in 2018, we were very much exposed to words from Brussels saying, if you deliver, we will deliver. So we have delivered on all the elements, and the Brussels has not delivered on time, at least not delivered when expected. And then the interest, the public perception has changed because people, ordinary citizens, but not only ordinary citizens, have felt like betrayed. They said, we have done everything from our side we could, but we have not received a proper award at the time when we expected. I have to remind you that on a couple of occasions, Even the government failed. There were resignations. There were elections 2 times in the meantime. And this had quite a strong impact also on the public perception. The public perception at the moment, we are trying, but very hard, we're trying to keep again above the surface of the water so that the people can breathe a bit of new, let's say, fresh air, which among other things is produced by this summit. And I hope with the IGC, which will be closed soon, open IGC, political IGC is not the end, but that's just beginning of the long ride until the full-fledged membership. And people do expect that we will not be, as a country, as citizens, exposed to new extraordinary, I am repeating, extraordinary requirements by the EU member states or by some of the EU member states, so that we can focus on really a job that we need to do in the country, and that's transposition of the acquis, building institutions that will be able to implement the acquis properly, and at the end, coming close to structural funds and other funds that should become available at the moment then we become members. So one is the political aspect, and the other is the finance and economic aspect, because the economic aspect and political aspect of the process of enlargement that creates the perception or positive perception are both sides of the same coin. We do everything in our power to keep the positive momentum, to keep the positive perception. But as I said, in the last couple of years, it was not an easy job. I don't know whether I've tackled all the elements of your question, Berta, but that's what I wanted to share at the moment.
Thank you, Dragan. I think you have, and actually you've touched a lot on a lot of the topics that I wanted of my next question to all of you, which was really to discuss this idea of the public perception in your countries, because I think to some extent there is a discrepancy and a disconnect, at least it's my perception, between, again, this rhetoric and then what's, you know, when you speak to people on the ground, the feeling is that really there's a lack of, that the process has lost credibility and a lack of stamina. And Dragan, you've already elaborated on the public perception of North Macedonia, but I wonder also if Blerim and Wouter can also discuss this issue. Yes, please.
Add one element, because I was watching very carefully the press conference after the summit, and you know, what strikes me is a very positive wording by President Michel von der Leyen and President Rama on one hand, and then the series of questions from the public. Journalists expressing, I noticed that too. And this is a very, very different angle of looking at the results of the summit. Yeah. I'm not going to question the results. Positive thing, it has happened. It is regular, very positive messages. But look at and very carefully listen the questions. Not all the questions have been answered, and not all the questions will disappear. And there are many other questions that need to be raised and will be raised in the coming period. So we need to bring closer. The communication is a key word. We need to bring closer these two sides, the politicians and the citizens, and we need to act as brokers. The governments and the institutions that work on the EU integration process, we need to be in the spotlights much more often. Sorry.
You are muted, but
sorry for taking the time, extra
yes.
time, but I
Okay.
just wanted to share with
Yeah,
you
no,
my impression.
that's a very relevant comment. Indeed, I noticed the same, and I feel like to some extent the comments of the journalists really reflect as well the feelings on the ground, and indeed I feel that there is a disconnect there. But Wouter and Blerim, perhaps you want to come in and give us your comments on this.
Okay. Shall I start?
Sure.
I mean, since I'm coming from the region, obviously, this question is about the region. I don't know what for the Netherlands can be said about the region and the public perception. I'm going to refer to the regional survey conducted by International Republican Institute that was done in the first quarter of 2022. So when you look at the data on the surface, everything seems fine. So in Bosnia, the support for joining the EU is 76%. In Kosovo, it's 85%. In Montenegro, 71%. North Macedonia, 66%, and in our northern neighbor, it's below 50%, which is 44%. However, I think the following data that comes below the surface, which looks into more or less as per entity level or ethnic group levels, is very worrying. For example, in Bosnia, so the support for joining the EU at federation level is 87%, whereas Republika Srpska is 57%. So there is a huge gap there of 30%. In Kosovo, among ethnic groups, so Albanians support 90% the accession, whereas Kosovo Serbs 36%, which is a reflection of the view in more or less of how Serbs also in Serbia see the accession process. In Montenegro, among the Montenegrin community, 79%. Among Serb community in Montenegro is 53%. Again, we have this almost 30% discrepancy. Among Albanian community in Montenegro, 87%, and Bosniaks, 95%. In North Macedonia, the data shows that among Macedonian community is 57% the support. Among Albanian community is 83%. So in fact, this, let's say, positive number of 66% is because of this huge difference that exists among ethnic communities there. And I think we need to really look into this, because this is where Russia is playing its spoiler and malign role. It's trying to basically amplify the differences and the conflicts between ethnic communities and entities in the region. And in the long run, I think this can be a very significant challenge for the peace and stability of the region. That's why we need to really take a note that overall, the elites are quite pro-European, but some ethnic groups are really moving towards being very, let's call them Eurosceptic, or against even the EU and the EU accession processes as such. And another important finding of this research done by IRI is, in fact, how people see whether EU is serious in its intention to offer membership to the Western Balkan countries. And here, the percentages, of course, are much lower. So in Bosnia, 44% of the people think that EU is serious. In Kosovo, 57%. In Montenegro, 54%. In North Macedonia, 42%. And in Serbia, only 27%. So there is, I think, support for EU process, EU integration, and the benefits it brings, both in terms of market economy and also democratic governments. However, because I think of being such a protracted process, 19 years since the Thessaloniki summit, I think the EU needs to really accelerate. And as it was mentioned, merit-based, I mean, this phrase rings a bit hollow in Kosovo, because, I mean, we have fulfilled the EU liberalization visa criteria for more than 4 years. I mean, if it's about the merits, we should have been granted visa lib so far. Unfortunately, it was not done, but we are very hopeful that by the end of this month, we'll get that decision done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blerim, indeed. Wouter, do you want to comment as well?
Yes, of course. And I fully agree, by the way, on the point of the merit-based process. I mean, the EU has not always taken steps based on merit in the past years, and that has, of course, fully has had a large impact on its credibility. So I fully agree on that, and I think the visa liberalization of Kosovo is the case in point in that regard. Now, when it comes to public opinion in the Netherlands, maybe I'll start with the bad news. I mean, there have been public pollings in the past years which showed that the Dutch population is rather skeptical. There was a study in 2018 that showed that over half of the Dutch population, I think about 60%, felt that the EU is actually already larger than it should be. That's the bad news. Now, this year, there was a new study from the Balkans and Europe Policy Advisory Group, the European Fund for the Balkans, and DPART, and that showed some more positive numbers. It's a representative study done, a polling done in April and May, and it shows that 45% of the Dutch citizens are actually in favor of EU enlargement with the Western Balkans, about 1/3 against, and I think about 22% said they were unsure about it. So the numbers, then you could conclude, okay, these numbers between 2018 and 2022 have become more positive. Is that really the case? And what could be the explanation for that? I think there are two major factors in that regard. The one is that there's been a real shift as a result of this Russian invasion of Ukraine. I think the geopolitics that we also discussed earlier when it comes to the political scene, also in people's hearts and minds, it plays a large role, and it has had a strong impact this year. I mean, the Dutch people were also very skeptical of the association agreement with Ukraine in 2016. And a polling this spring said that 60% of Dutch citizens would be in favor of also enlargement with Ukraine if the conditions are met. And that's the big if, of course, that for the Dutch is very important. But the other factor that plays a role, I think, this survey that was done this year by our partners from BIEPAG and DPART and the EFB, it's really the first survey that zooms in on EU enlargement and asks all these questions about the countries themselves, about how the process works, about perceptions people have of the countries, whether an EU enlargement is a salient topic for them, so whether it really matters for citizens in the Netherlands. Because, of course, if you have a public polling and you ask someone, do you support further enlargement of the European Union? Well, maybe not, of course, but at least in the Netherlands, people will tend to say no. But if you ask some follow-up questions and you enter a conversation and you also, people become aware that there is a whole process built around that with all sorts of criteria, and that there are countries that are already in that process for a long time and trying to become part of the EU, then I think you get a much more nuanced picture. So maybe just some of these results from the study that I found very, very interesting. So people in the Netherlands do not really consider EU enlargement a salient issue. They do not find the topic very important. The knowledge is also quite low. I mean, but that's amongst all groups. So it's not that those who support EU enlargement also have more knowledge about the region or about the process. And actually, it's a bit shameful for me to say, but there was a question where people had to point out the region on the map. And I'm afraid that only 42% of the Dutch were able to point out which 6 countries constitute the Western Balkans, with another group opting for a map that highlighted Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, and Slovakia, I think. And some people even, I think about 20% picking the map that showed Turkey, the 3 South Caucasus states, and even Syria was in there. So this knowledge is a bit low, and there's something to be done there. So what did matter for people's perceptions of EU enlargement? I think it's 2 things. The one is that attitudes towards EU enlargement are closely related to trust people have in Dutch political institutions and in EU political institutions. And second, personal affiliation with the region. So if people have actually traveled there, if they know someone from the region, it really matters. So in conclusion, I mean, Dutch citizens have become somewhat more positive. It's still not really a salient topic for them. And I just have the feeling that people's thoughts and positions are not very much developed, right? Which also means that there's room actually for Dutch politicians to maybe become a bit more vocal on the issue. Political scene is a bit hesitant to talk about EU enlargement. I think there's room to talk more about the topic. And there's a need to better explain the functioning of the EU, the enlargement process, etc. gain this trust in the EU, which will translate also into trust in EU enlargement. So these are basically, this is sort of the latest state of play in the Netherlands when it comes to the topic, and will be interesting to see how it develops in the future.
Thank you, Wouter. Indeed, I think it's very relevant points, and I wonder also the role that our politicians in the member states play in really bringing the enlargement topic to the national debates and also clarifying their own electorates and domestic constituencies. And I think there needs to be more linkages between also our public perceptions in the member states and implications for enlargement as well. So thank you very much for that. I think it's a very important element to the discussion. Before I will close the debate, there's one last question from Serafin Dinkel. That speaks about the role of China. What role does China, its economic investments and political engagement play in the relations between the Western Balkans and the EU today? Indeed, a very relevant question that we haven't touched upon in this discussion, but I wonder if maybe Blerim and Dragan and Wouter as well, if you have some comments.
If I may, Marta, because I have to
leave.
Yes,
okay, of course. Yes, absolutely.
So Kosovo is the only country in the region that has not accepted or agreed to because of any investments from China. If you look the numbers, they are staggering of the level of investment that they have done in Serbia, for example, around 17 billion euros investments. And there are very famous projects, infrastructure projects financed in Macedonia, North Macedonia, and also Montenegro, which some are considered as debt traps as well. But what we have noticed on the ground is also political interest by China. So China is very much interested about political developments in the region. It's not just this economic interest. They have clearly made headways in terms of trade exchange. So then, for example, if we look at the data from Kosovo, trade exchange has increased significantly with China, even though it's a non-recognizing country, but the numbers and volumes of trade exchange have increased in the last couple of years. So China is becoming more and more present economically in terms of trade exchange, but also it's showing greater interest of political developments in the region, and probably they will try at a certain stage also influence these political developments, and this is reflected mainly in the foreign policy choices of the countries of the region. So whereas this relation of the region with the EU is more value-based and it's really intrinsic and it permeates all levels of governance and society, China, since it doesn't have per se a specific integration process in mind, but it still has this agenda, and we have seen in some countries to be quite aggressive.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I look forward to joining similar
Thank you very much. Thank you for staying with us. Thank you.
Yes, may I just
yes,
a few
please.
words, maybe
yes.
not only related to China, but maybe start with China. Considering that China is not on the list almost of our trade partners, so we have very little trade volume and exchange with China. Over 74.5% of our trade volume goes to EU. 2/3 of the investments, foreign direct investments, are coming from EU. So we are very much connected with the EU industry, economy, and financial system as well. So China is not present, I would say, in the country, except that huge loan that we have got a long time ago, before the China became an issue at the European continent. We are fully in line with the CFSP and CDSP. And I think that this is the starting point whenever we talk about the relations between North Macedonia and China. We are following the suit of the EU, and will do so in the coming period. We are witnessing the differences, or the gap that is becoming bigger and bigger in the relations between the USA as our NATO ally and China, and between the EU and China. And this triangle is creating a new, let's say, geopolitical landscape, and a new relations, a new set of relations between these three sides. It's clear for us we are Euro-Atlantic oriented. We are members of NATO already. We are following all the, as I said, CFSP, but also sanctions, whoever is imposing on the side of the EU and the USA. And this is the element that always has to be taken in consideration and kept within our foreign policy, but also trade policy as well. I do agree that there are some differences around in the region. So we have the common denominator because all the countries in the region have SAA and they all applied except Kosovo. And I hope that Kosovo will apply soon for a membership into the European Union. But there are also some differences that has to be taken in consideration whenever we are talking about the foreign policy and trade policy of the region or particular countries in the Western Balkans towards China or towards Russia and other partners in the region, other actors, I would not say, but other actors in the region. So we have differences over NATO membership, we have differences over CFSP and CDSP, we have differences towards the sanctions to Russia, Belarus, and some of China. We have differences in CEFTA implementation. We have differences over Berlin process and open Balkan. We have differences over the common regional market in certain areas. And we are not all members of the WTO, World Trade Organization. So all these elements also has to be taken in consideration whenever we are talking about the regional cooperation. But I would put an emphasis on the wording regional integration that has been used within the declaration from Tirana, because Tirana is talking about regional integration. So we will have to keep in mind when we are talking about regional integration, we have first to clean up the to clean up the air, to clean up the ground, so that we all have an equal playing field, so that the regional integration can really happen, and we are not trapped within the regional integration as an alternative to full-fledged EU membership and integration into the EU institutions.
Of course, of course. Wouter, one last comment from you?
Very shortly on China, then I think China plays a less malign role in the region than the one that we see Russia playing in the past years. I think the one risk is that sort of these differences in standards that we see, right, between China on the one and EU on the other, and this presence of China in the Balkans through investments, etc., it should not mean that the countries actually move further away from meeting EU standards. So you see that Chinese investments in infrastructure, for example, or in industries, they sometimes conflict with environmental standards of the EU, with public procurement standards. Sometimes that also then allows, because public procurement rules are circumvented through direct government deals, it allows for continuation of corruption or less transparency or whatsoever. So I think we do need to be careful about the role of China in the region, as we need to be careful about the role of China in the EU itself, because of course these dynamics are very much the same. Only in the EU, I think the EU is a little bit more resilient to these kind of things than the region at this moment. So it is something to keep in mind in the time to come.
Absolutely, and there is some correlation there. I would like to end this policy dialogue, thanking you very much for taking the time to participate and for your very, very insightful comments. I think we covered a lot of ground. There's always other things and other things that we could have spent a lot of time discussing, but thank you so much for your participation in this discussion today. Many thanks as well to our audience for staying with us. I wish you all a wonderful rest of the day, and we'll continue to closely monitor how this new momentum will affect enlargement policy and specifically in the Western Balkans. So please stay tuned to our future initiatives, and we'll look forward to welcoming you again in our future events. And thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.